In a world that often tempts us with the promise of luxury and ease, there are those who find themselves drawn to paths they never anticipated. Today, I will share with you the story of a young girl named Emily, who grew up in a humble neighborhood but dreamed of a life far from poverty. Her journey, however, is one not of triumph, but a cautionary tale about the choices we make when faced with despair, and the price we pay when we seek wealth above all else. Through Emily's story, we'll explore profound themes of empathy, moral fortitude, and the true essence of wealth. This tale, while heart-wrenching, is also one that shines a light on community, compassion, and the enduring strength found in love and family. If you feel a connection with these values, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and join our community. As you listen, consider sharing a message in the comments like, "I cherish the bonds of love and family above all else." Now, let us begin Emily's story, one that reminds us of the true cost of forsaking our principles. Emily was just 19, with eyes full of hope and a heart brimming with dreams. She grew up in a small, close-knit neighborhood on the outskirts of Houston, a place where everyone knew each other's names, and where the whispers of neighbors often traveled faster than the wind. The neighborhood, though poor, was grounded in a sense of unity and support. People would lend a hand, share what little they had, and look out for one another, especially for the young ones like Emily, who showed promise. Emily was known for her kindness and her hardworking nature, always willing to lend a hand to the elderly Mrs. Parker next door or help watch the younger children in the community. But Emily was different. While others in her neighborhood seemed content with their lives, however modest, Emily had bigger dreams. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, imagining herself living a life of elegance and luxury. She often felt that her kindness, her diligence, and her dreams were too big to fit within the walls of her small neighborhood. She wanted more than just working at the local diner, more than the faded wallpaper of her tiny bedroom, and more than the simple life her parents had led. Then came Lacey. Lacey was like a vision from one of Emily's daydreams, fashionable, confident, and surrounded by an aura of sophistication that immediately caught Emily's eye. Lacey was an outsider, someone who had made it and come back to the neighborhood with stories of luxury and ease. She became friends with Emily, taking her under her wing and introducing her to a world Emily had only dreamed of. To Emily, Lacey's life seemed like a golden ticket, a chance to escape the cycle of poverty that had gripped her family for generations. Lacey's stories filled Emily's mind with visions of designer clothes, glamorous dinners, and carefree days. Lacey spoke of how easy it was to get ahead if one only knew how to play the game. "You don't have to suffer like this, Emily," Lacey would say with a smile. "There's a whole world out there, just waiting for you to take what you deserve." The words settled deep into Emily's heart, awakening a longing that had only been a whisper before. But with Lacey's influence, that whisper grew louder, filling her with a desperate desire to break free from the life she had always known. At first, Emily tried to resist. She knew her family wouldn't approve, and she had been raised to value honesty, hard work, and resilience. Her parents had sacrificed so much to give her a stable home, even if they couldn't provide much beyond that. She had grown up with stories of her grandparents' struggle to build a life in Houston, of her father's double shifts to keep food on the table, and her mother's dedication to raising her with integrity and love. Emily knew the strength of her roots, yet her dreams seemed to pull her away from all of that, like a tide she could no longer resist. Lacey, sensing her friend's hesitation, continued to paint a picture of ease and wealth. "Imagine, Emily, a life without struggle. You deserve to live like a queen, not a servant. People get ahead every day by being bold enough to take what they want." Slowly, Emily's resolve began to weaken. She began to see the boundaries of her neighborhood not as a comforting embrace, but as a cage keeping her from the life she felt she deserved. One evening, Emily found herself sitting across from Lacey in a small cafe just outside her neighborhood. Lacey was as radiant as ever, her laughter and charm drawing the attention of everyone around them. Over coffee, Lacey laid out a plan. "You could be free, Emily. No more waiting tables, no more living paycheck to paycheck. I know people who can help you get the life you want. You just have to be willing to let go of what's holding you back. Her voice was smooth, persuasive, filled with a promise of a brighter tomorrow. It was at that moment that Emily made her decision. Her heart fluttered with excitement, her mind racing with the possibilities Lacey had painted. All the warnings, the lessons her parents had taught her about hard work, integrity, and humility seemed to fade in the glow of the life she imagined for herself. She was ready to follow Lacey's advice, to step into a new world where the struggle was a distant memory and luxury was within her grasp. Emily felt a strange exhilaration mixed with fear. Deep down, a voice whispered to her, questioning the path she was about to take. But the promise of wealth and ease, of finally living the life she had always dreamed of, was louder than that quiet voice. Lacey, sensing Emily's internal conflict, took her hand. "This is your chance, Emily. You don't want to look back in 10 years and regret not taking it." With those words, Emily's last bit of resistance crumbled, and she agreed. And so began Emily's journey, a journey that would lead her down a path she could never have imagined. What started as a dream of a better life would soon turn into a nightmare of moral compromise and emotional isolation. As Emily took her first steps into this new world, she couldn't have foreseen the cost of what she was about to gain, or the deep, irrevocable impact it would have on her life. As the days passed, Emily found herself distancing from her family and friends. She spent more time with Lacey, absorbing her friend's ideals, values, and ways of getting ahead. She became enchanted by the allure of easy money, convinced that her new path would be her ticket to freedom. But little did she know that the path she was embarking on would lead her further from everything she held dear, dragging her into a cycle of moral decay that would cost her more than she could ever imagine. Emily's initial steps seemed harmless enough, but her choices would soon lead her to a point of no return. Next, we'll witness her first devastating decision, a choice that will alter the course of her life and force her down a road that even Lacey's guidance couldn't prepare her for. Emily's first steps on this new path seemed almost too easy, a smooth descent into a world where consequences felt like distant shadows. After a few weeks of soaking in Lacey's philosophies and observing her lifestyle, Emily began to feel the full weight of her decision. But she was resolute. She believed that, finally, she had found a way out of the life that had seemed to strangle her ambitions. And she was willing to push aside her lingering doubts, focusing instead on the promise of a prosperous future. It was during this time that Emily met Carter. At first, Carter seemed to be everything she thought she needed: charming, confident, and quick with a compliment. He had a way of making Emily feel special, as though she was finally stepping into the life she had longed for. Carter was not a part of her old world. He seemed to fit perfectly into the glamorous life that Lacey had described. And for a while, Emily believed he would be the missing piece to her happiness. However, it didn't take long for the cracks in Carter's facade to start showing. Carter was unreliable, the kind of man who promised the world but seldom delivered. His words were as smooth as honey, but his actions told a different story. Still, Emily clung to the image she had created of him, seeing him as a partner who would help her escape her old life for good. But in the back of her mind, doubt began to creep in. Carter's promises of better days ahead were becoming harder to believe, yet she held on, fearing that letting go of him meant losing her only chance at happiness. Then, fate delivered a twist she hadn't anticipated. Just as she was becoming aware of Carter's flaws, Emily discovered she was pregnant. She was filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. A child could change everything. She imagined a life she could build, a life where her child would never know the struggles she had faced growing up. However, when she told Carter the news, his reaction was far from what she had hoped for. Instead of support, Carter reacted with shock and anger, distancing himself from Emily almost immediately. He was unprepared, unwilling, and ultimately uninterested in taking on the responsibility of a child. As days passed, Emily found herself more and more alone. Carter's visits became infrequent. His calls grew sporadic, and soon he disappeared altogether. Emily was left with nothing but broken promises and the looming reality of raising a child on her own. As the weight of her situation settled in, desperation began to claw at Emily's heart. She had left her old world behind, believing that wealth and glamour would free her from hardship. But now she was facing a future even bleaker than the one she had left behind. She felt trapped, cornered by her choices, and her dreams of luxury now seemed impossibly out of reach. Feeling isolated and overwhelmed, Emily sought out advice from those she trusted. Her family, of course, was out of the question. They would only try to convince her to return home, urging her to raise the child as a single mother within the safety of their community. And Lacey? Well, Lacey's enthusiasm for Emily's path seemed to have waned ever since the news of the pregnancy. She had spoken of freedom and glamour, not the realities of motherhood or the responsibilities that came with it. With few options, Emily found herself reaching out to an unlikely source, Ms. Mabel. Ms. Mabel was a local midwife and herbalist, known in the neighborhood for her knowledge of natural remedies and her calm, wise presence. Though they had never been close, Emily remembered Ms. Mabel's reputation for helping young women in difficult situations. She hoped that Ms. Mabel might offer her a solution, a way to escape the difficult reality she now faced. Sitting in Ms. Mabel's small, warm home, surrounded by shelves of jars and dried herbs, Emily confided her fears and regrets. She spoke of Carter's abandonment, her shattered dreams, and the desperate loneliness she felt. She poured out her heart, hoping for words of comfort or a simple solution to erase the mistakes she had made. Ms. Mabel listened patiently, nodding and offering a cup of herbal tea to calm Emily's nerves. Then, with a seriousness that seemed to weigh down the room, Ms. Mabel spoke. She suggested something that made Emily's heart skip a beat. She could sell the child after its birth. It would be a way to relieve Emily of the burdens she faced, a way to ensure the child would be raised in a stable, loving home. At least, that's what Ms. Mabel assured her. Emily could take the money, use it to start fresh, and finally achieve the life of comfort she had longed for. The suggestion struck Emily like a thunderclap. Sell her own child? The very thought felt like a betrayal of the innocence growing inside her, a being she had not yet met but already felt responsible for. However, Ms. Mabel's words lingered in her mind. She painted it as an act of kindness, a decision that would benefit both Emily and the child. The weight of her desperation began to tip the scales, and slowly, Emily found herself considering the unthinkable. The days that followed were filled with agonizing thoughts. Emily would walk through the streets of her neighborhood, watching mothers with their children, feeling the ache of her own heart as she wrestled with her decision. Part of her wanted to believe that Ms. Mabel was right, that giving her child a chance at a better life far from the poverty and struggle she had known was an act of selflessness. Yet another part of her felt a growing sense of guilt and shame, a feeling that what she was contemplating went against the very essence of motherhood. In the end, the allure of freedom and wealth won over. Emily convinced herself that she was making the right choice, that the child would be better off without her struggles and limitations. She made arrangements through Ms. Mabel, who knew families willing to pay for a chance at parenthood, couples who had the means to offer a life of privilege. It was arranged quietly in the shadows of a community that still believed Emily was just a young girl with big dreams. The day of the child's birth arrived, a day marked by both joy and sorrow. As Emily held her newborn in her arms, she felt a surge of love unlike anything she had ever known. For a moment, she considered keeping the child, raising it herself, and finding the strength to make it work. But Ms. Mabel's words echoed in her mind, and the promise of a life without struggle, one where she could finally achieve her dreams, pulled her back from the edge of maternal instinct. With trembling hands, she handed over her child. The money felt cold in her grasp, a cruel reminder of the price she had paid for her freedom. She convinced herself that this was her only option, that the child would be better off, and that now she could finally begin the life she had always wanted. Yet as she watched the couple drive away with her child, a hollow emptiness settled within her, a silence that no amount of wealth could fill. Emily told herself it would get easier, that with time, she would forget the pain and find solace in her new life. But deep down, a quiet sorrow began to grow, a feeling that she had lost a part of herself, a piece that could never be replaced. Emily's decision seemed final, but the pull of wealth and freedom had only just begun its grip on her. Next, we'll see how the taste of easy money leads her into an endless cycle of compromise, one that will ultimately test every shred of her humanity. As time passed, Emily did her best to adjust to her new reality. The money she had received was enough to pay off her debts and secure her a small, comfortable apartment away from the familiar streets of her old neighborhood. She invested in new clothes, adorned her space with modest luxuries, and tried to convince herself that this was the life she had been working towards. In the beginning, she felt a brief sense of relief, a fleeting satisfaction with what her choices had brought her. But something else lingered beneath the surface. No matter how many possessions she acquired, or how much she tried to distract herself, there was an ache inside her that wouldn't go away. At first, she ignored it, chalking it up to nerves or the natural doubts of someone venturing into an unfamiliar world. But as the weeks turned into months, the emptiness grew, creeping into every quiet moment, every pause in her carefully crafted new life. She felt haunted by memories of her child's first cries, the softness of that tiny hand grasping hers, and the look in the couple's eyes as they drove away with a part of her heart. Desperate to move forward, Emily threw herself into her quest for wealth with renewed determination. She convinced herself that what she needed was more money, more comfort, more distance from the past that seemed to haunt her. She began exploring other opportunities, attending social events and connecting with people who shared her newfound desire for financial freedom. She listened to their stories, their tales of wealth acquired through unconventional means, and once again, the promise of easy money began to captivate her. Then something happened that would test her resolve. She found herself once again pregnant, this time with no one to share the burden with. The father was an acquaintance she had met in her social circles, someone as careless and directionless as Carter had been. Upon discovering her pregnancy, he offered no support, vanishing just as quickly as he had appeared. Emily was alone, facing the same desperate situation she had once tried to escape. In the quiet hours of the night, Emily wrestled with her choices. She could keep the child, try to start fresh once again, and live with the consequences of her past decisions. But the thought of struggling to raise a child on her own, without the financial means to provide a secure future, filled her with dread. The allure of the life she had promised herself, the life of freedom, comfort, and financial independence, was too powerful to resist. Remembering Ms. Mabel's initial suggestion, she felt herself drawn back to that same unthinkable choice. The decision she had once believed would be a one-time solution now presented itself as a path she could continue down, a way to turn her circumstances to her advantage. She knew she could find another couple, another family willing to pay for the chance to raise a child, especially with the connections she had made. In her mind, she rationalized that this decision, painful as it was, would offer the child a better life than she could provide. And so, Emily made the choice. She sold her second child, taking the money and using it to further secure her position in the world she was building for herself. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that she was ensuring these children would have better lives than she could ever offer. But the sense of loss was unavoidable, annoying pain that no amount of money could silence. She threw herself deeper into her quest for wealth, using the money she earned to reinforce the walls she had built around her heart, hoping that eventually the emptiness would fade. Yet it didn't. The world Emily had once longed for began to lose its shine. She went through the motions, investing in luxury items, attending high society gatherings, and surrounding herself with people who valued wealth above all else. But with every dollar she spent, the void inside her grew. She began to realize that no amount of money, no level of comfort, could replace what she had lost. Her choices had granted her a certain kind of freedom, but at a cost that was far greater than she had anticipated. Emily's decisions became a cycle, a relentless pursuit of wealth that seemed to swallow her whole. Each time she faced hardship or financial strain, she found herself making the same choice: selling the very bond that was meant to ground her in love and purpose. The lure of profit had taken hold of her, and with every transaction, she lost a piece of herself. Distancing further from the kind, hopeful girl who had once sat on her porch dreaming of a better life, she learned to numb herself, to quiet the nagging voice within her that cried out in regret. But as much as she tried to silence it, the weight of her choices became harder to bear. She couldn't escape the knowledge that she had traded love for wealth, that she had sacrificed the innocence of her own children for the hollow promise of an easier life. In moments of solitude, she would feel the crushing realization that she was caught in a cycle, one that seemed impossible to break. Emily's relationships began to crumble as well. The friends she had once cherished grew distant, sensing the change in her spirit. Her interactions became shallow, transactional, lacking the warmth and compassion she had once held dear. People began to see her as cold, driven only by her desire for wealth, and in time, even her closest companions drifted away. She was left isolated, surrounded by luxuries that now felt like chains, binding her to a life devoid of true joy. And yet, the pull of greed remained. Despite her growing dissatisfaction, despite the pain that lurked in the corners of her heart, she couldn't bring herself to abandon the life she had chosen. The fear of returning to her old life, of facing the hardship she had once known, held her captive. She clung to the belief that with just a little more money, a few more sacrifices, she could finally find the happiness that had eluded her. But deep down, she knew the truth. She knew that her pursuit of wealth had led her down a path of self-destruction, one that had cost her the love and peace she had once cherished. She had gained everything she thought she wanted, only to find herself more lost than ever. One evening, as she sat alone in her lavish apartment, surrounded by the symbols of her wealth, Emily felt an overwhelming wave of sadness. She realized that she was trapped, imprisoned by the very things she had once longed for. She had sacrificed her values, her family, and her own happiness for a life that now felt hollow and meaningless. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless and filled with regret. She saw with painful clarity the legacy she had created, a legacy of isolation, loss, and greed. She knew that her choices had led her down a path of emptiness, a road that could never lead to the peace and contentment she had once sought. Emily's journey had stripped her of nearly everything that once mattered to her, leaving her trapped in a cycle of regret and loneliness. Yet, her actions had not gone unnoticed by the community she left behind. Next, we'll explore the moment her community takes a stand, determined to uncover the truth and bring justice to those who had been harmed by her choices. Emily's pursuit of wealth had consumed her entirely. She lived in a finely furnished apartment, surrounded by the trappings of success, elegant furniture, designer clothes, and jewelry that glittered under the soft lights. From the outside, she appeared to be living the life she had once dreamed of, a life free from want, where she could indulge in every comfort without a second thought. But within the walls of her luxurious home, Emily found herself caught in an unending emptiness, a darkness that wealth couldn't chase away. After the second child, Emily had promised herself that she would not go down the same path again. She told herself that the sacrifice had been for the greater good, that her children would have lives filled with opportunities she could never provide. Yet, as time went on, she realized that these promises to herself had become hollow. The money from each transaction offered only temporary relief, filling her life with things but leaving her heart painfully empty. When she found herself pregnant for the third time, her decision to sell the child felt disturbingly automatic. By now, she had become adept at silencing her conscience, brushing aside the pangs of guilt that arose every time she thought about the life she was sacrificing. She convinced herself that she was simply doing what was necessary to survive. The financial comfort brought a temporary solace, and she told herself she could finally relax, finally live in peace. But the peace never came. With each transaction, Emily's resolve to live a life of ease became stronger, but so did the hollow ache that seemed to deepen with every decision. She became a shell of the girl who had once been filled with dreams of happiness and fulfillment. In her heart, she began to sense that wealth, as it turned out, was a fleeting thing. offering little comfort when weighed against the lives she had given up. But by now, she was caught in a relentless cycle, one that she didn't know how to escape from. As she continued down this path, Emily distanced herself from the community where she had grown up. The neighborhood that had once been her haven felt like a constant reminder of her choices. She rarely visited, and when she did, it was with hurried steps, eyes downcast to avoid the familiar faces of people who might still remember her as the kind-hearted girl they once knew. Yet, the community had not forgotten Emily, nor the stories of the children she had brought into the world, only to have them vanish without a trace. Rumors began to spread, whispers in hushed tones about Emily's mysterious wealth and the curious disappearances of her children. Her once supportive community started to piece together fragments of the story, their concern growing into a quiet anger. People began to question her, discreetly at first, but as the pattern became undeniable, their whispers grew louder. Emily felt their eyes on her whenever she visited, saw the disapproval that lingered in their gazes. The neighborhood that had once been her refuge now felt like a place of judgment, and she retreated further, seeking solace in her material comforts. But even as she distanced herself from her community, Emily found herself in constant need of more wealth. She felt trapped by the very comforts she had fought so hard to obtain, feeling an insatiable hunger for more security, more luxury, as though each new possession might somehow fill the emptiness within her. The cycle of greed became relentless, a force that drove her forward, even as her heart grew heavier with each step. And so, when she found herself pregnant once again, the decision to sell the child was almost a reflex. By now, the remorse she had once felt had dulled, replaced by a numb acceptance of her choices. She was aware of the judgment in the eyes of her former neighbors, the whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But her need for wealth had consumed her completely, and she chose to ignore the pain that came with her decisions. Emily's actions did not go unnoticed by the family she left behind. A few concerned neighbors started to piece together the pattern: young children, born and then mysteriously gone without a trace, replaced by Emily's ever-growing fortune. Word of her actions began to reach beyond the bounds of her neighborhood, and soon enough, even people from surrounding communities had heard the stories. What began as whispers of pity soon became cries of outrage. Her community, once supportive and understanding, became united in their demand for answers. The outrage spread like wildfire, uniting the people who once saw her as one of their own. The rumors reached the ears of local authorities, and as her community began to call for justice, Emily found herself facing a scrutiny that felt almost unbearable. Friends who had once stood by her side now looked upon her with disdain, horrified by the depths to which she had fallen in her pursuit of wealth. She was no longer the girl they had known, no longer the kind-hearted soul who had once helped with neighborhood chores and watched over the local children. In her isolation, Emily tried to cling to the wealth she had acquired, as though the material possessions around her could somehow shield her from the judgment of her community. But even as she held onto her luxurious surroundings, she knew that she was utterly alone. The community had closed its doors to her, and in her heart, she felt the full weight of her choices pressing down on her. The news of her actions spread far and wide, stirring up emotions within the people who once cared for her. Her former friends, her neighbors, even strangers who had only heard her name, were united in their disdain. Emily became a pariah, shunned by those who had once embraced her, condemned by the very people she had turned her back on. She found herself on the receiving end of the same cruelty she had once inflicted on her children. Abandoned and alone in her pursuit of a hollow dream, the shame became unbearable, an unrelenting reminder of the life she had sacrificed for wealth that could not bring her the happiness she sought. As the weight of her choices bore down upon her, Emily began to question everything she had once believed. Her actions, which once seemed like a path to freedom, had only led her into a prison of her own making. Alone in her apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her pursuit of wealth, Emily felt the full force of her regret. She realized that no amount of money, no luxury or comfort, could replace the love she had lost. She had traded her family, her community, and her own humanity for a life that now felt like a cruel joke, an illusion that had left her emptier than ever. As the community continued to demand justice, Emily knew that her time was running out. She could no longer ignore the voices calling for accountability, the whispers of people she had once known now rising into a chorus of condemnation. Her choices had led her to a point of no return, a place where the weight of her actions was impossible to escape. Emily's life had spiraled into a place of isolation and regret, but her story was far from over. Next, we'll see the full extent of the community's response, as they band together to demand justice for the lives Emily had traded away. In the face of overwhelming condemnation, Emily will be forced to confront the consequences of her actions, and her journey will take a turn she could never have anticipated. The community's anger was no longer a silent whisper. As the stories spread and suspicion solidified, people could no longer look the other way. Emily's actions had struck at the heart of everything they valued: family, trust, and compassion. What had once been quiet concern was now a storm of outrage, driven by the pain and betrayal that radiated through the neighborhood she had once called home. It started with small gatherings, a few neighbors coming together to share their worries, comparing notes about the peculiarities of Emily's newfound wealth and the vanishing children. The stories were heartbreakingly similar, each child a symbol of innocence, born with the hope of a better future, yet quickly disappearing from their lives. The community remembered the kind young girl Emily had once been, and they couldn't reconcile that image with the cold, calculating person she had become. The quiet gatherings soon swelled, drawing larger crowds of people united by a common purpose. Those who had known her as a child, who had watched her grow up, felt a profound sense of betrayal. Their sadness morphed into righteous indignation as they pieced together the pattern of her actions. One by one, voices rose, demanding answers, seeking justice not only for the lost children, but for the community that had once embraced her. The elders of the neighborhood, respected figures who had known Emily's family for generations, took it upon themselves to lead the charge. They went door to door, gathering testimonies, connecting with others who shared their grief and anger. Emily's choices had left scars on the community, and they were determined to make sure she would face the consequences. Together, they began crafting a plan to bring her actions into the light, to ensure that her wealth would not shield her from accountability. For Emily, the wave of judgment felt like an inevitable punishment. She could no longer escape the gaze of her former friends and neighbors. Their eyes bore into her, filled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. In every face she recognized, she saw disappointment and disgust, reminders of what she had done and of the person she had become. Her former sanctuary had turned into a place of condemnation, and she had nowhere left to hide. Rumors of her actions spread beyond the neighborhood, reaching people in surrounding areas. Local leaders began to take notice, and community groups banded together to investigate further. They demanded accountability, refusing to let her escape the consequences of her choices. People who had once viewed her family with respect now saw Emily's actions as a stain on the community's values, and they would not rest until justice was served. As the anger grew, so did the determination to uncover the truth. People began digging into the details, tracing every child, every transaction, every whisper of the wealth she had accumulated. The community organized rallies, held meetings, and demanded that the authorities take action. They wrote letters, shared stories, and raised awareness, determined to protect future generations from the pain caused by Emily's decisions. It was no longer about punishing her alone. It was about restoring the balance of their community, healing the wounds her actions had left behind. Emily, meanwhile, felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her like a suffocating burden. Her wealth, once a source of pride and comfort, now felt like an anchor around her neck, reminding her of the lives she had shattered. She no longer found solace in her luxurious apartment or in the trappings of success she had once prized. Every possession reminded her of the price she had paid, the choices she had made, and the trust she had broken. Her loneliness became unbearable. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in on her, the silence amplifying the voices of those she had wronged. She could feel the community's anger like a pulse, beating louder with each passing day, and she knew that there was no escaping it. Her life had become a shadow of what she had once dreamed, and the illusion of happiness she had chased now mocked her from every corner. At night, sleep became a distant memory. Her dreams, once filled with visions of success and wealth, had turned into haunting reminders of the children she had forsaken. She could see their faces, hear their cries, feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a leaden blanket. She had tried to escape her past, to bury it under layers of luxury and comfort, but it had found her nonetheless, stripping her of every ounce of peace. Finally, the day came when the community's efforts bore fruit. With mounting pressure from her former neighbors and the leaders of the area, local authorities launched an investigation into Emily's activities. The families who had taken in her children were contacted, and the pieces of her story began to fall into place. One by one, the layers of her deceit were peeled away, revealing the extent of her actions. For the community, it was a bittersweet victory. They had achieved justice, but it came at the cost of losing one of their own, a girl they had once believed in, a girl who had turned her back on everything they held dear. They mourned the loss, not just of the children, but of the promise Emily had once embodied, a promise of hope, of rising above hardship, of achieving success without compromising integrity. Her choices had broken that promise, leaving behind a legacy of pain and regret. Emily was brought before the community, forced to face the people she had once known, the people she had deceived and hurt. There were no words that could undo the harm she had caused, no explanation that could ease the pain of those she had betrayed. She stood alone, surrounded by familiar faces twisted with sadness and anger, a living testament to the destruction wrought by her greed. As she faced the community's judgment, Emily felt the weight of her decisions crushing her. She realized in that moment that the wealth she had chased had left her with nothing but emptiness. The luxury, the comfort, the fleeting pleasures, all of it had cost her the very things that made life meaningful. She had forsaken love, family, and integrity, trading them for an illusion that had crumbled around her. In the silence that followed, Emily finally understood the true cost of her choices. Her pursuit of wealth had led her to a place of isolation, a life devoid of the warmth and connection she had once taken for granted. She had gained the world, only to lose herself in the process. And now, standing before her community, she was left with nothing but regret. Emily's journey seemed to have reached its lowest point, as she faced the community's wrath and the harsh reality of her choices. But her story was not yet over. In the final chapter, we will see how the weight of her regret leads her to a life of profound loneliness and reflection, as she comes to understand the true meaning of love and wealth, far too late to change the course of her life. After facing her community and the weight of their judgment, Emily withdrew completely from the world around her. She had no choice but to retreat, haunted by the faces of those she had hurt and the children she had abandoned. Her apartment, once filled with the reminders of her wealth and aspirations, now felt like a prison, a silent witness to her downfall. As she sat in the empty rooms, surrounded by luxury she could no longer find comfort in, Emily came to realize the devastating truth. Her life had become a hollow shell. The once vibrant girl who had dreamed of breaking free from poverty now found herself trapped by her own choices. She had spent years believing that wealth would free her from hardship, that the glittering image of success would erase the struggles she had known. But instead, each dollar, each possession, had added another layer to the walls that separated her from her humanity. Now, stripped of the community she had once been a part of, she was left to face the consequences of her actions in solitude. The days turned into months, and Emily's isolation only deepened. She stopped attending the social gatherings she once enjoyed, cut off from the acquaintances who had admired her for her success. Without the veil of her wealth, her social connections dissolved, leaving her with no one to confide in, no one to share her burdens. Those who had once praised her for her ambition now viewed her with disdain, and even strangers seemed to sense the darkness that clung to her. In the silence of her empty home, Emily was left with her memories. She found herself constantly reliving the choices that had brought her to this point, unable to escape the haunting images of the children she had sacrificed. She remembered each birth, each farewell, and each payment that had marked her descent into the relentless pursuit of wealth. The memories were relentless, filling her nights with dreams of tiny faces and small hands reaching out for a mother who was never there. She awoke each morning with a crushing sense of loss, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with an intensity that left her breathless. Emily's life became a cycle of reflection and regret. She began to understand, in the quiet hours of her solitude, the true cost of her choices. She had forsaken love, the love of her children, the love of her community, and the love she might have found in herself. She had traded away the very bonds that give life meaning, blinded by the promise of ease and comfort. Her actions had left her with a legacy, not of success, but of loneliness. A legacy that would follow her until the end of her days. As the years passed, Emily's once youthful face began to show the signs of her sorrow. The lines etched into her skin were marks of regret, reminders of the choices that had stolen her happiness. Her once bright eyes dulled, and her spirit grew weary, weighed down by the years spent in isolation. She could no longer find joy in the things that had once brought her pleasure, no longer take comfort in the luxuries that surrounded her. Each item in her home felt like a painful reminder of what she had lost, a symbol of the lives she had destroyed in her pursuit of wealth. In her solitude, Emily began to seek understanding, a way to make sense of the life she had lived. She read books on philosophy, on spirituality, on the nature of love and forgiveness. She hoped that somewhere in the pages, she might find a way to make peace with herself, to find a purpose beyond the regret that consumed her. But the answers eluded her, slipping through her fingers like sand. She found no comfort in the words, only a deeper understanding of the emptiness she had created within herself. One day, as she walked through a quiet part of town, Emily passed a group of children playing in a nearby park. Their laughter filled the air, bright and carefree, and for a moment, she felt a pang of longing so strong it nearly brought her to tears. She watched them, mesmerized by the innocence and joy she had forfeited. Each child's face seemed to remind her of the children she had lost, the children who had been denied the love of a mother. She stood there for a long time, watching from a distance, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she could never be a part of that world. In that moment, Emily realized the full extent of her loss. She understood that wealth could never replace the love of family, that success was meaningless without the bonds that give life purpose. She had spent years chasing an illusion, only to find herself more alone than ever, a stranger in a world that had once been her home. She felt a wave of sorrow wash over her, a sorrow so deep that it seemed to reach into her very soul, leaving her empty and numb. As she turned to leave, Emily noticed an elderly woman sitting nearby, watching the children with a gentle smile. The woman's face was lined with age, her eyes bright with the warmth of a life filled with love. Emily felt a pang of jealousy, mixed with a yearning for the peace that radiated from the woman's presence. She knew, in her heart, that this was the life she had given up, the life she could never reclaim. The woman caught her eye and nodded in greeting, a simple gesture of kindness that pierced Emily's heart. She managed a weak smile in return, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. In the days that followed, Emily withdrew even further into herself. She became a recluse, rarely leaving her home, avoiding the world that had rejected her. Her wealth, once her greatest achievement, had become a prison, a constant reminder of the choices that had stolen her happiness. She spent her days in quiet contemplation, grappling with the loneliness that had become her only companion. As the years wore on, Emily's health began to decline. The weight of her sorrow had taken its toll, leaving her frail and weary. She had no family to care for her, no friends to visit her in her time of need. The community she had once turned her back on had long since moved on, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. She realized in her final days that true wealth is found not in possessions, but in the love and connections we share with others. She had spent a lifetime seeking comfort and security, only to find herself more lost than ever. In the end, Emily's life became a cautionary tale, a story told by the community as a reminder of the dangers of forsaking one's values for the empty promise of wealth. Her legacy was one of regret, a life marked by the loss of what truly mattered. She passed away in solitude, her story fading into memory, a whisper carried by those who had known her, a lesson etched into the hearts of a new generation. Emily's story serves as a poignant reminder that wealth, when sought at the expense of love and integrity, leads only to emptiness. Her journey, filled with choices that brought only fleeting satisfaction, reminds us that true riches are found in family, compassion, and the bonds we share with others. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more thought-provoking tales. And if you feel inspired, leave a comment below with the words, "I value love and integrity above all wealth." Thank you for watching, and remember, true wealth is in the heart.